1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
At 27 minutes to 10, we talk about a very important anniversary, and that is it's 76 years since the launch of the Geneva Conventions, the foundational international treaties that set rules to protect people during armed conflict. And of course, as we know, Africa has borne the brunt of that. To help us understand the importance of this anniversary, the challenges, and of course, a future in terms of today's complex wars, we're joined now by Professor Andrew Clapham, a leading expert in international humanitarian law at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Professor, firstly, let me thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I do understand that we've cut into your vacation time, so we're even more grateful that you've taken the time to speak to us, to educate us, and of course, just to speak about this very important subject.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for your interest in the Geneva Conventions. As you say, I mean, they're foundational and they are supposed to protect the victims of war, but I don't think it will be news to your listeners that, of course, we're going through a catastrophic situation at the moment where we see and read about them being violated every day.
And let's just then start with the genesis of the 76 years ago. What was the context? What was the objective when setting up these statutes?
Well, it was the end of the Second World War, and after the Second World War, it was realized that there were a number of gaps in the hard law that was supposed to protect people, particularly the victims of war in times of armed conflict. And so there was a lot of updating done, for example, with regards to prisoners of war or the wounded or health workers and so on. But the big step forward was to ensure first that civilians would be protected, particularly in occupied territory. And secondly, that these laws would apply to civil wars, to, in the jargon, non-international armed conflicts. I mean, just to give you examples today, for Sudan and South Sudan, for example, there is provisions in the Geneva Conventions that apply directly to those conflicts. During the Second World War, it was just assumed that the laws of war applied to interstate conflicts, but a big step forward, as I say, was taken in 1949. And this is the law which is applied today to all armed conflicts around the world.
And as you speak about South Sudan, would you say 76 years on, this has been either one of the greatest failures or greatest lies behind the intention, whether intentionally or not, as we speak about the international law, humanitarian laws being violated, that of protection of humanitarian officials, for instance?
Well, I mean, yes, clearly there's a failure. The question is, where does the failure come from? In my view, it's not in the text. It's not even in the way it was designed in 1949. The failure is that the authorities, the international community, the Security Council, the African Union, the governments are not prepared to take action to ensure these rights are respected. We don't see people being prosecuted for war crimes. You don't see sanctions being imposed on individuals or entities that are refusing to abide by the Geneva Conventions. So I would sort of turn the question around and say, you know, what are people doing to actually make this law effective and to punish those who violate it? It's not that the law itself has failed. I don't think there are really gaps in the Geneva Conventions that need to be filled. What we need is action and implementation and political will to take this stuff seriously.
So last year we saw a push by countries like Brazil, China, France, Jordan, Kazakhstan and South Africa launch a global initiative to renew political will for international humanitarian law. Was it because of those gaps that they saw, whether it be accountability or implementation? There obviously was something seen or perceived as wanting.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And it's to be welcomed that states such as South Africa joined that initiative right from the get-go, from the beginning. the gap that they've identified is the failure to implement and the failure to take it seriously. And I mean, more prosaically, I suppose, the failure to educate troops and individuals in what all this means and why they should take it seriously. So it's a re-energization and a recommitment to these rules, recognizing that they're being violated. But states like South Africa and Jordan, Indonesia and others can do quite a lot to reinforce the rules. I give maybe one example. The Geneva Conventions have within them a regime called the grave breaches regime. It means that if anybody travels abroad who is accused of violating one of the Geneva Convention provisions that leads to a grave breach, they should be arrested and prosecuted in whatever country they happen to be visiting. That regime is very underused, misunderstood, and not applied. But I think when governments like South Africa and France and others get involved, it means that they take seriously a visit from somebody to their country who, accused of grave breaches, ought to be punished rather than just let go on their way.
But then you've also seen countries who've either not signed some of these Geneva Conventions or who have withdrawn from them. So, as you say, the problem is not in the vision, but is it an issue of relevance?
Yeah, I'm going to maybe just for the record say, in fact, the Geneva Conventions are unique in the world in that they're the only treaties that everybody has signed. So every single state in the world is bound by them. And so far, nobody has withdrawn. So the problem is not there. The problem, as you're suggesting, is the sort of the failure to implement these existing obligations. And that's why this recommitment to make them better understood and better implemented is so important. So I can only hope that more and more states will take them seriously, but not just in terms of public statements and joining panels and so on, but take a hard look at their law and see if it's their own internal laws and see if it's fit for purpose. Do they have punishments for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions? Are they ready to prosecute? Do they have war crimes units? Are they sanctioning individuals who fail to respect the Geneva Conventions? I think there's a lot that can be done. It's a sort of a bit of a sleeping beauty in a way that it was adopted 76 years ago, as you said at the beginning. But it's really this year, remarkably, that people are making a bit of an effort to try to get them better respected.
So then, okay, let's talk about what respect then means in this case. So you say they've received universal ratification and that they're the only conventions in which all countries have signed. Does it mean that they are then blatantly being ignored in terms of the letter and the spirit of the laws of those conventions? If we take, for instance, the United States, when we talk about the humane treatment of prisoners of war, Guantanamo Bay was a subject of a discussion for many years and investigations, and yet the levels of accountability, it's not just the United States, there are many other countries. We're seeing now what is happening with Russia and Ukraine, who are speaking with Human Rights Watch about executions that some are seen as politically motivated, some even religiously motivated in Saudi Arabia and many other countries. So in those cases, what is happening? Are these signatories who are just blatantly ignoring the conventions of which they're co-signatories?
I mean, it's difficult to say that they're ignoring them, in that if we had somebody from the United States here now to explain the situation in Guantanamo, they would go through a lot of legal gymnastics to explain that these individuals were not prisoners of war and so they weren't violating the treaties and so on. But I mean, there's an obvious comeback that the principles in the Geneva Conventions did apply to those individuals. Even if not technically prisoners of war, it's illegal to torture people. And the United States would not deny that they had tortured individuals. Now, as you know, there's been a big investigation. Whether anybody has been prosecuted for the war crime of torture under the Geneva Conventions is another question, and you're right to raise it. Very few people have been prosecuted out of all of those incidents of torture in the wake of September 11 and the whole Guantanamo incident. So it's not the fault of the treaty as such, because it outlaws torture. It's not that they necessarily haven't signed it or they're trying to avoid it. It's that there wasn't the political will in the executive, in the president's office, to punish those as war criminals on their own side.
So,
It's the same for all states. I mean, Russia doesn't prosecute its own people for war crimes. Very few states do. I suppose that's why I was emphasizing the possibility of prosecuting someone when they travel abroad rather than expecting states to do it, which it's their obligation to do. But for political reasons, it's not a good look when you're prosecuting your own people for war crimes. And in my experience, states tend not to do it.
what then is the role of multilateralism in holding states to account, looking at the Israeli military response to Hamas, or terrorist organizations, as they say, being what is happening in Gaza?
I mean, there are, as you will know, efforts at the multilateral level to hold Israel and Israeli individuals to account. There's the case which has been brought by South Africa at the International Court of Justice against the State of Israel. And the International Criminal Court famously has issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the now former Minister of Defense, for violations of the Geneva Conventions. So it's step by step. I think there will be more arrest warrants issued, I would presume, and states around the world are starting to sanction individuals from Israel, from elsewhere, from Russia, for violating the Geneva Conventions. Of course, they don't necessarily travel to the states that are sanctioning them. But the more states that get interested in ensuring that the Geneva Conventions are respected, the more people, I would hope, would start to think first before violating them.
But there's also the moral responsibility that is carried by signing the Geneva Convention. If you look at the International Criminal Court, it's come under criticism, heavy criticism, to a point of ladling sanctions on individuals of the ICC by the United States. So in such cases, can we still say organs of the spirit of the Geneva Conventions are still being respected, are still being taken seriously? And it's actually the perfect example right now, given the contentious issue of what is happening in Gaza and growing calls for genocidal acts to stop.
I mean, I can only agree with you. The international organs are under attack. As you say, the United States has sanctioned individuals from the International Criminal Court. That's one state that has done that. It doesn't mean that the International Criminal Court can't operate. It doesn't mean that other states are incapable of respecting the Geneva Conventions and prosecuting individuals who violate it. So, I mean, I don't want to make an appeal to the media, but how we tell the story affects how the Geneva Conventions get respected. If the story is, nobody seems to care about them anymore and no one is being punished, it's a dead letter, that starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we say, as you just said, everybody has signed them, everybody is bound to respect them, and those who violate them will be punished. It might not be tomorrow, but it will be at some stage. The prosecutions for some of the international crimes in Serbia or in Argentina, took a long time to happen, decades. But once you violate the Geneva Conventions and you commit a grave breach, that war crime sticks with you for the rest of your life, and you could be held accountable at any time.
And you're absolutely right in raising the fact and the issue around how we frame the narrative and what is happening with and around the Geneva Conventions. And it's precisely why I asked the questions about actions by the United States. We may say at this point that it's just one country, but we've seen a lack of a failure to sanction it for its actions. We've also seen some countries who've supported its actions. So it is important to get a sense of where the scales of justice, so to speak, lie. Are people being vocal about what is happening around them? And it does boil down to accountability.
Yes, I mean, there has been some pushback against the United States for sanctioning a UN functionary recently, and the special rapporteurs have issued a press statement saying this is a blatant violation of the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities. So I think, it's early days on some of these sanctions questions as to exactly what will happen. But I don't think it's the end of the Geneva Conventions, and I don't think it's the end of multilateralism. I think it's challenging, and it's a particularly dark moment in the history of the UN and the history of multilateralism, indeed in the history of the Geneva Conventions. And it's good that you're having this program so that they are sort of kept alive in a way, and we can begin to discuss, how they should be implemented, rather than seeing them as a sort of historical interest.
So do they need updating? We live in a different world. Digitization is a big part of that. So when we talk about the respect of humanitarian law, especially by, in some cases, non-state actors, there's new and emerging technologies such as autonomous weapon systems, artificial intelligence. Are the conventions enough to hold those individuals that are either involved in programming, building, deploying, etc., etc.?
I mean, you ask a very good question. I mean, clearly, artificial intelligence was not around when the Geneva Conventions were written. And clearly, it poses a huge challenge for continuing to respect international humanitarian law. I think there are efforts now to write new texts, new treaties, if you like, add-ons to the Geneva Conventions. States are very excited about artificial intelligence and the potential it gives them to be more effective on the battlefield. And so far, progress has been rather slow in, if you like, slowing the progress of artificial intelligence. There is a real danger in that it can be used to speed up decision-making, get a lot of information, and give soldiers or commanders a great sense of confidence that the targeting they're going to be committing is within the rules. And I think those people who study this say that that is very, very dangerous because, one, it's going to be very opaque, the way in which artificial intelligence does this. And precisely as you say, if artificial intelligence makes the wrong calculation as to how many civilians deserve to die, who is going to be held accountable? Impossible to find the programmer, many years later. And you can't just sort of say, we'll give the death penalty to the artificial intelligence. It needs some real thinking about. States have started on this, but I fear personally that those who see the greatest advantage from using artificial intelligence will block any meaningful multilateral break on the use of artificial intelligence on the battlefield or in times of armed conflict. And I totally agree with you that it poses a huge challenge, which is not necessarily going to be resolved just by pointing to the Geneva Conventions.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Once again, much appreciated. As I said, we really appreciate you taking time out of your vacation. Professor Andrew Clapham, a leading expert in international humanitarian law at the Geneva Graduate Institute, speaking to us about that anniversary, 76 years since the establishment of the Geneva Conventions, the foundational international treaties that set rules to protect people during armed conflict. And that brings us to 9 minutes to 10.